You're listening to Black Agenda Radio. I'm Margaret Kimberly. We're joined by Abayomi Azikiwe, editor of Pan-African Newswire. He joins us from Detroit with an update on the 2-year-long conflict in Sudan as government forces make headway in retaking the capital of Khartoum. Is this humanitarian crisis nearing its end? Abayomi Azikiwe provides analysis. Thank you again for joining me.
Thank you again for the invitation.
Abayomi, it's been a few months since we talked about Sudan. First, let's get our listeners caught up on this situation. Tell us when and how this all started.
The latest phase of this civil war began on April 15th of 2023, nearly 2 years ago, and it erupted due to a disagreement between the two main factions of the military apparatus in the Republic of Sudan, the Sudanese Armed Forces, which is headed by Abdel Fattah al-Burhan, and the Rapid Support Forces, which is a paramilitary unit that's headed by another general, Delgado, also known as Hamedi. They had a disagreement over the transitional process, how much power each branch of the military would have in a purported democratic transitional process in Sudan, which has been extremely complicated since 2019. We're talking about 6 years. This mass upsurge, democratic movement, the removal of the former head of state, al-Bashir, and then, of course, the installation of an interim prime minister, Abdallah Hamdok. That was in 2020. His overthrow, or reinstatement, then overthrow again. And then, of course, the reconsolidation of power by the transitional military forces in Sudan. Then the outbreak of a civil war between the two main factions of the country. So that's where we are right now. We have approximately 12.6 million people that have been displaced out of a population of approximately 51 million people. 8.5 million people are internally displaced persons, IDPs, people who have fled the country as refugees. There are approximately 4 million people. They've gone to the Central African Republic. They've gone to Chad, South Sudan, Egypt, Ethiopia, Libya, and Uganda. Those are the main areas where people have fled the fighting over the last nearly 2 years. So at this point, there's no real effort to bring about a negotiated settlement. There's been numerous attempts to do that over the last 2 years. They have all failed. And right now, it appears as if the Sudanese Armed Forces has the upper hand in the fighting. They retook the presidential palace just last week in the capital of Khartoum. Nonetheless, there's fierce fighting that's continuing in the country in various provinces. It's heavily concentrated in the area in Darfur, White Nile, and Kordofan regions. So that is a general outline of where we are right now in regard to the Sudanese internal civil war.
Abayomi, according to news reports, the government forces retaking or being close to retaking the capital city is presented as being a major change in the conflict. Is that the case?
I would say so. It represents a major defeat for the RSF. They have claimed they are winning the war. And of course, with them losing the presidential palace, losing the central part of Khartoum, all there's fighting still going on in the area. But it is definitely a major defeat for the RSF. We'll see what the position of the RSF leadership will be in the weeks to come. But they have lost territory and lost a lot of their fighters, and people are aware that they are, in fact, doing a lot of damage to civilians and civilian infrastructure, particularly in the Darfur area and in other areas too in Sudan.
And who is backing the RSF? Where do they get funds? Where do they get their arms, their military equipment?
Well, this is a very interesting question because the United Arab Emirates has been accused of funding the RSF, and it has a lot to do with the control they have over certain mining interests in the country. And that has been brought before the United Nations Security Council. The United Arab Emirates has denied that they are backing the RSF, but at the same time, they've accused al-Burhan, who is the de facto head of state, of, in fact, refusing to negotiate an end to the war. Although the RSF has said that they are willing to negotiate an end to the war, they have not stopped fighting. They have not stopped their aggressive actions against civilians. I think that the RSF is going to be under a lot of pressure, even from the United Arab Emirates, to try to reach some type of settlement with the de facto head of state, who is now controlling the presidential palace in the capital.
So the head of state was not in the capital at some point? Is that what you're saying?
They were in the capital, but they were not in the central part where the presidential palace is, which is like central, the central institution of the previous government. So, yeah, they are still fighting, though. According to reports, there's still fighting going on in certain parts of the capital and outside the capital.
And what has been the position of other African states regarding this conflict?
They all want to bring it to an end. Now, in Kenya, there's been some problems between the government in Kenya of William Ruto and the al-Burhan military government in Khartoum. There was a meeting in Kenya where the RSF compiled a list of organizations which they say represent a parallel government. So it's a question of whether or not the SAF will do the same thing. But that has caused a strain in relations between Kenya and the military government in Khartoum. The fact that they were allowed to meet in Kenya and issue a declaration for a formation of a parallel government has strained relations between Nairobi and Khartoum. But there are other aspects, too, of this. In Ethiopia, for example, where the African Union is based, they have made efforts over the last several years to bring about some type of negotiated settlement. The Intergovernmental Authority on Development, IGAD, which is a East African regional organization, have also attempted to bring about some type of negotiated settlement. The United Nations has been involved as well. The U.S. Has been involved. So there's been several international entities and states that have been involved in trying to bring about a negotiated settlement, but it has not worked over the last nearly 2 years.
And what has been the history of U.S. relations with Sudan?
It has not been positive. Just in recent years, they have attempted to destabilize the government under the previous president, al-Bashir. They did this through encouraging the International Criminal Court to serve indictments on al-Bashir. He, of course, is now still in detention over the last 6 years after he was overthrown around April of 2019. And of course, after that, the U.S. was involved in order to prevent a genuine democratic revolutionary movement from coming to power in Sudan. They were involved even prior to that in fostering the partition of the country. Prior to 2011, the Republic of Sudan was the largest geographic nation state on the African continent. They were an emerging oil-producing nation. Yet, over the last 14 years, that has declined. The population, of course, is less due to the partition. And at the same time, the U.S. Has attempted to bring Sudan back clearly into the Western fold. They have been pressuring even the interim prime minister, who was in office during the previous Trump administration, was coerced into making a statement saying that they would recognize the state of Israel as a legitimate state. Now, this even went against the actual constitutional law of the Republic of Sudan. They passed a Israeli Boycott Act in 1958, just 2 years after they got their national independence in 1956. They passed a bill banning any type of economic relations between Sudan and the state of Israel. This was in 1958. So Abdallah Hamdok, the economist who was the interim prime minister, had no authority whatsoever to make this agreement with Donald Trump. Of course, Abdallah was overthrown in 2021, reinstated, and then overthrown again. We could go back and talk about the charges that Osama bin Laden, the former head of the Al Qaeda organization, was based in Sudan. Sudan was bombed under the Clinton administration in 1998, ostensibly for harboring the Al Qaeda leader and claiming that there was a chemical weapons factory in Khartoum, which was bombed, which turned out to be a pharmaceutical plant that produced medicines and baby formula. And of course, there was never any apology on the part of the administration of Bill Clinton. This goes back as far as 1998. And this was done in response to the bombing of the U.S. Embassy in Nairobi, Kenya, as well as Dar es Salaam, Tanzania, in August of 1998. So there's been numerous incidents. It has a long history that goes back decades in regard to the role of the United States involving itself in the internal affairs of Sudan. Sudan has oil. It's also strategically located. They have that important port, Sudan, on the Red Sea. And the U.S. definitely wants to control that part of the Horn of Africa.
And the Trump administration, I recall in the first Trump administration, these Abraham Accords, which asked countries in the region to recognize Israel in exchange for some sort of consideration. What is it that Sudan hoped to get out of this?
They hoped to get debt relief. They were thinking that the U.S. would remove them as a state sponsor of terrorism. And that is very important for any nation in a system, a world system that's still dominated by international finance capital. When they have internal turmoil, when there's international debt and international debt service, there needs to be some intervention on the part of the banks and those countries that control these banks, like the United States, to declare a potential for reorganization of the debt, and also to remove that label of being a state sponsor of terrorism, which in doing that, that means that you are blocked from certain forms of credit, trading networks. So it's a very dangerous category to be placed in. That's similar to what has already been said about certain states such as Iran, the Republic of Cuba, and so forth. So they were hoping to get some debt relief, to be eligible to get loans and refinancing from International Monetary Fund, the World Bank, and other international financial institutions, and also to try to get back in the good grace of U.S. imperialism and its allies. But it has not worked. There's still sanctions that are being carried out against Sudan, against both factions, both the RSF and the SAF. They've, in fact, the U.S., in fact, under Biden, instituted new sanctions against the RSF. We'll see what happens over the next few weeks. If the SAF continues its offensive that is successful, there could be a new effort to bring about some type of ceasefire and a negotiated conclusion to the war. But Sudan is a vast country, and the divisions and the conflicts are very deep. For example, in the West Darfur region, which had been a focus of a lot of controversy 2 decades ago, the Khamis Abubakar, who was the governor of West Darfur, was assassinated. And it said he was assassinated by the RSF. So this is, of course, has fueled the existing hostilities to new levels.
And yes, Sudan is a vast country. I'm looking at a map now, and Sudan is bordered by Egypt, Libya, Chad, Central African Republic, South Sudan, Ethiopia, and Eritrea. And I think that vastness is an indication of the complications that are involved in trying to resolve this conflict.
Yes, and it's a former British colony. The people there fought seriously, against British, the onslaught of British colonialism. They fought for many years on a mass level against colonialism, and eventually in 1956, they gained their national independence from Britain. But the way in which the British carried out their colonial process, it's always a divide and rule under British colonialism. They divided the southern part of the country from the northern part of the country, and the western part of the country against the northern part of the country, and the eastern part of the country against the northern part of the country. So there's a lot to overcome in regard to structural difficulties. For example, in 1955, right on the eve of national independence, a civil war broke out between the leadership of political leadership in the south of the country and the what became the de facto government of Sudan. That civil war lasted from 1955 to 1972, was ended in 72 for 11 years, then it resumed again in 1983, and it didn't end for another 2 decades. There was a ceasefire, then, of course, a negotiated settlement, which resulted in partition of the country, which was a major defeat. If you look at what is going on worldwide, there's more and more consolidation of nation states and regions in regard to economic issues and political issues. So to have this type of partition and division that was done at the aegis of U.S. imperialism, British imperialism, and Zionism, then it was clearly a defeat for the people of Sudan and the people of Africa. But although that was the case, the UN, as well as the African Union, still recognized the Republic of South Sudan. And even within the Republic of South Sudan, since the partition, there's been armed conflicts that have been ongoing, internal civil war inside the Republic of South Sudan. And even today, it's very, very tenuous ceasefire that is in existence. We'll have to see what happens in the Republic of South Sudan as well.
And you mentioned Israel. What is Israel's role in the affairs of Sudan and South Sudan?
They were major backers of the Sudan People's Liberation Movement, which is the leading political party inside the Republic of South Sudan. They provided weapons and diplomatic cover during the war against the Republic of Sudan. So therefore, they bear responsibility along with Britain and the United States. They also accused the former government of al-Burhan, Omar Hassan al-Burhan. They accused him of, at one point, of supplying weapons to the people in Gaza to fight against the Zionist regime in Tel Aviv. Of course, so they're very concerned to have a pro-Israeli government in the capital of the Republic of Sudan in order to prevent assistance to the Palestinians in the Gaza Strip.
And I'm noticing that Sudan's flag is very similar to the flag of Palestine, a slight difference in color, but they are very similar. Why is that?
Yeah, it goes back to the early origins of colonialism in the so-called Arab states, which are really in West Asia and North Africa. And the forces, Britain and France, who carried out the institutional and classical colonial efforts in that region, wanted to have similar flags in all these different countries that were colonized by Britain and France. So that explains partially why the colors are similar to the colors in other so-called Arab states in the region.
And we've talked about Israel's interference in the affairs of African countries is not something that's well known or talked about enough. Talk to us about Israel's activities on the African continent.
Well, you mentioned earlier the Abraham Accords, which are pretty much dead right now. But I'm sure that the Trump administration, on its current trajectory, will try to reinstitute that by attempting to either force the Palestinians out of Gaza. That was one proposal, to force them completely out, have them to relocate in Egypt and in Jordan, and then just take over the entire Gaza Strip, have it as a resort, which will probably be micromanaged by the state of Israel and the United States and other imperialist countries. But Israel wants recognition. They want to divide their neighbors and enemies. They've been doing this in an attempt to normalize relations with Saudi Arabia. They already have a relationship with Jordan. We know Egypt is perhaps still the second largest recipient of U.S. Foreign assistance. So yes, they want to divide the entire region so they can maintain their authority and to expand their influence in the land that they control throughout West Asia. We saw that with the recent war against Lebanon. The maps that have been presented when Netanyahu speaks before the United Nations, there's really no borders delineated for the state of Israel. Zionism is an ongoing open project that's closely allied with U.S. imperialism.
We've discussed the other nations that surround Sudan. How do they impact Sudan? For example, in 2011, the United States destroyed the Libyan state. It still does not have a unified state all these years later. How did that, as an example, how did that impact Sudan and other countries in the region?
It's the same project to divide, conquer, and rule. They destroyed Libya, and as you mentioned, 14 years later, they still do not have a unified government. There's still factional fighting that's going on in Libya. The country under the Jimahiriya, led by Colonel Muammar Gaddafi, was the most prosperous African state on the continent. Very large oil producer of natural gas, huge savings. They virtually owed no money to the International Monetary Fund or the World Bank. And of course, that made them a target for the Obama administration. And they, of course, destroyed the country, killing anywhere between 50 to 100,000 people, displacing 2 million people. After the destruction of Libya, we've seen the rise of jihadist groups throughout the region, particularly in West Africa. We saw what happened in Mali, Burkina Faso, Chad. The internal problems escalated, as well as Niger. Some of those states today have broken away or attempting to break away from imperialism. We have the Alliance of Sahel States. And even following them, countries like Chad, for example, which have been close allies of the U.S. and France, asked for French troops to leave. Senegal, which has a new government that took power last year, has also asked the French to leave. So we see these developments. Cote d'Ivoire, another former French colony, has asked the French military forces to leave. So I think people are realizing, even those who want to maintain good relations with the U.S. and France, that it has not helped their people, their governments at all. In fact, they've become even more unstable. And of course, it's been revealed that Ukraine, which receives a tremendous amount of U.S. military, political, and diplomatic assistance, in fact, we're training and arming these counter-revolutionary rebel groups in Mali. This triggered the severing of diplomatic relations with Ukraine. So it's clearly obvious that the U.S. is behind a lot of the destabilization that's going on in West Africa and North Africa as well.
So there's a continuing thread, isn't there, about the way the U.S. deals with African nations, administration after administration, Democrats or Republicans. There is a theme of the way the U.S. interacts with African countries.
Yeah, even right now, they're trying to, well, there's been reports about potentially recognizing Somaliland as a breakaway region in Somalia, to recognize it as a legitimate state in exchange for some U.S. presence in the area. There's also reports about a possible rare metals and minerals deal, strategic resources deal between the Trump administration and the Democratic Republic of Congo. Whether these things develop or not is clearly an indication of their ongoing interests in the strategic resources as well as the important geographic locations and maritime locations of these African states. And people need to keep in mind that in the Republic of Sudan, approximately 30 million people right now are in need of assistance, whether it's food assistance, blankets, tents, medicines. And this is becoming more and more difficult since the Trump administration has cut back on its foreign assistance programs. There were problems with them, but at the same time, if you talk about food, blankets, temporary housing, medications, that means that many more Africans are going to die as a result of U.S. policy. So we need to keep that in mind.
And how do our listeners find out about your work?
You can go to our blog at panafricannews.blogspot.com. That's panafricannews.blogspot.com. They can follow me on social media. I'm on Facebook, X, Instagram.
Thank you. Thank you so much, Abayomi. I look forward to having you back. And that was Abayomi Azikiwe, providing an update on events in Sudan and other African nations.
Join the Comgiverse Patreon for exclusive content, behind-the-scenes access, and special perks. Support the channel and connect with a community of revolutionary intellectuals and scholars. Click the link in the description to join now.